Top of the morning to you, and welcome to our special coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Olumide Macaulay. The headlines: death toll from missile strike in Kramatorsk rises to 8. United Nations adds Russia to list of shame for killing children in Ukraine. Plus, U.S. State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller says the United States is planning action to hold Wagner Group accountable over activities in Africa. Thank you for joining us as rescuers sift through rubble at the scene of yesterday's missile strike on the eastern Ukrainian city of Kramatorsk. The death toll from that attack has risen to 8, including 3 children. That's according to Ukraine's State Emergency Service. Ukrainian officials previously reported 4 deaths. At least 56 others were injured in the strike, including an infant. A Russian missile strike struck Kramatorsk busy city center on Tuesday evening, according to the Ukrainian Prosecutor General's office. The missile struck an area lined with apartment buildings, stores, and cars, as well as hitting a crowded restaurant in the city center. Meanwhile, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said Russia deserved defeat and a tribunal after the eastern Ukrainian city of Kramatorsk came under missile attack. As rescue crews combed through a shattered restaurant in search of casualties, the Ukrainian president said in his nightly speech that the dead included a child, and that the latest attack came on the anniversary of the Russian terrorist attack on Kramatorsk, a shopping center where 22 people were killed. Mr. Zelensky also says Ukraine's military had made advances on the front and thanked all soldiers involved. A new report on global killing of children has been officially presented by the United Nations. And amongst the findings is that Russia killed 136 children in Ukraine in 2022. As a result, the United Nations added Russian armed forces to a global list of offenders in the report. The United Nations also verified that Russian armed forces and affiliated groups maimed 518 children and carried out 480 attacks on schools and hospitals. According to the report, Russian armed forces also used 91 children as human shields. However, Russia has denied targeting civilians since it invaded Ukraine on February the 24th, 2022.
Changes to the report this year. In Ukraine, the Secretary General decided to list the Russian armed forces and affiliated armed groups under Section B of Annex 2 for attacks on schools and hospitals and for killing of children, in particular through the use of explosive weapons with a wide impact area, including shelling from heavy artillery, multiple launch rocket systems, missiles and airstrikes in populated areas, which resulted in a very high number of casualties and the destruction of infrastructures. The Russian Federation and affiliated armed groups have been listed under Section B of Annex 2 in consideration of the ongoing engagement they had with me since last year and also following my visit to Russia in May. I am committed to continue this engagement to make sure that measures identified to end and prevent children from grave violations are being implemented. And I note that decreases in these 2 violations have already started to occur as soon as my engagement commenced in August 2022 to date. The Secretary General decided to also warn the Ukrainian armed forces in Section 5, owing to the high number of children killed and maimed and of attacks on schools and hospitals attributed to them. While we are aware that Ukraine's military actions are in response of Russia's aggression, the CAC mandate applies to all parties to conflict and whether grave violations are committed during offensive or defensive operations. The warning serves to remind Ukraine of the importance to uphold international humanitarian law and international human rights law going forward. In 2022, children continued to be disproportionately affected by armed conflict. We had 27,180 grave violations against 18,890 children. About two-thirds of them boys, a third girls, a little bit more than a third girls. We covered 24 situations and one regional monitoring agreement, the Lake Chad Basin, as had been agreed 2 years ago. The lack of respect for international humanitarian law and human rights law had a devastating impact on the protection of children in armed conflict, which resulted in a dire year for children living in situations affected by armed conflict.
Lithuanian President Gitanas Nausėda is expected to meet the Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky in Kiev to discuss NATO as Ukraine seeks to enter the alliance. President Zelensky stepped up calls for Ukraine to receive a political invitation to join NATO at the July the 11th to the 12th summit of alliance members in Lithuania. NATO members are close to agreeing incremental steps to strengthen ties with Ukraine by the Vilnius summit, but have yet to resolve differences over how to address Ukraine's desire for membership. Lithuania has been one of the staunchest supporters of Ukraine in NATO and the EU and has been calling for accepting it into both. Meanwhile, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg says the events in Russia over the weekend have shown the war in Ukraine has deepened divisions in Russia. But Ukraine's allies still cannot underestimate Russia and must keep supporting Ukraine. Mr. Stoltenberg's comments come after a working dinner with the leaders of several NATO member states in The Hague, days after Wagner forces briefly occupied a strategic command center for Russia's Ukraine war and marched on Moscow before turning back in a rare challenge to its military leadership. Speaking at a news conference, Mr. Stoltenberg said it's too early to speculate on the effects of the move of Wagner troops to Belarus, but stressed the alliance is ready to defend itself against any threat.
We all saw the events in Russia over the last days. These are internal Russian matters, but what is clear is that President Putin's illegal war against Ukraine has deepened divisions and created new tensions in Russia. At the same time, we must not underestimate Russia. So it's even more important that we continue to provide Ukraine with our support. I think it's too early to make any final conclusions on the long-term consequences, including for NATO. But what we can say is that we are, of course, closely monitoring the developments, and we have already increased our readiness, our preparedness, and our military presence in the eastern part of the alliance. We will make further decisions to further strengthen our collective defense with more high readiness forces and with more capabilities to ensure credible deterrence and defense for the whole alliance.
Last Saturday, we all have seen the mutiny of the Wagner Group in Russia. If Wagner deploys its serial killers in Belarus, all neighboring countries face even greater danger of instability. Under such circumstances, deterrence and forward defense is a top priority.
We heard those questions of ladies and gentlemen here about the Wagner's group in Belarus and the presence of Mr. Prigozhin in Belarus. In my opinion, this is really serious and very concerning problem, and we have discussed, and we have to make some decisions, very strong decision. It, in my opinion, requires a very, very, very tough answer of NATO.
The Pentagon has announced that the United States will provide Kyiv with a new military package worth up to $500 million in a show of support for Ukraine's fight against Russia as Moscow deals with the aftermath of the mutiny by the mercenary fighters. Pentagon spokesman Brigadier General Pat Ryder says the package will include ground vehicles, including Bradley fighting vehicles and Stryker armored personnel carriers, and munitions for high-mobility artillery rocket systems.
Secretary Austin also reiterated that support by the United States for Ukraine will not change, and that remains our focus. And toward that end, the Department of Defense announced earlier today additional security assistance to meet Ukraine's critical security and defense needs. This is the 41st drawdown of equipment from DoD inventories for Ukraine since August 2021, and includes key capabilities to support Ukraine's air defense requirements, as well as additional armored vehicles, anti-armor systems, munitions, and other equipment valued up to $500 million to help Ukraine defend their nation and take back sovereign territory.
Meanwhile, the White House Deputy Press Secretary Olivia Dalton also reiterates that the military package includes mine-clearing equipment, armored vehicles, artillery rounds, anti-armor systems, and ammunition for the HIMARS rocket systems. The package is being funded using Presidential Drawdown Authority, or PDA, which authorizes the president to transfer articles and services from U.S. stocks without congressional approval during an emergency. The material will come from U.S. excess inventory. The security assistance package is the 41st approved by the United States for Ukraine since the Russian invasion in February 2022 for a total of more than $40 billion.
Today, the Biden-Harris administration is announcing a new security assistance package for Ukraine as we continue to stand with the people of Ukraine as they defend themselves from Russia's brutal invasion. This package includes key capabilities that will support Ukraine's counteroffensive operations, such as mine-clearing equipment, armored vehicles, and artillery rounds. It will also strengthen air defenses to help Ukraine protect its people from rocket attacks and provide Ukraine with additional anti-armor systems and ammunition for the HIMARS rocket systems that Ukraine is using so effectively on the battlefield. This is the 41st drawdown of equipment from the DoD inventories using presidential drawdown authorities for Ukraine that Congress approved last year with strong bipartisan support.
Meanwhile, U.S. State Department spokesperson Matt Miller says the United States will very soon announce actions to hold the Wagner Group accountable, although the move will be over the mercenary group's prior activities in Africa and won't be linked to the aborted mutiny in Russia over the weekend. However, Mr. Matt Miller did not detail what the planned U.S. action will be, but when pressed, said it will be announced this week. After the break, Russia's Deputy UN Ambassador Dmitry Polyansky says President Putin looked strong after Wagner mutiny. Please stay with us. Welcome back to the So For More stretch of our coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine today. Russia's Deputy UN Ambassador Dmitry Polyansky says Russia is stronger and support for President Vladimir Putin is consolidated after the brief mutiny by the Russian mercenary leader Yevgeny Prigozhin and his Wagner troops. Wagner fighters, led by Prigozhin, succeeded in taking control of the city of Rostov-on-Don, with the military command center steering the Ukraine campaign and driving an armed convoy across Russia within 200 kilometers of Moscow on Saturday. Mr. Putin, in a defiant televised address this week, says he deliberately let Saturday's 24-hour mutiny by the Wagner militia go on as long as it did not avoid rather as long as it did to avoid bloodshed, and that it had reinforced national unity.
Part of the United States.
The people that are asking this question are obviously do not Russian, and they do not understand Russia. Because if they did, they would really see it from absolutely different optics. The country has become more stronger, and the president's support has consolidated, and I think that's quite obvious for everyone who is open-mindedly analyzing Russia, not who has some Russophobic optics. They are, of course, disappointed, and I think that we will continue to disappoint them even more. I think he looks strong, and our country looks stronger than ever because we were united to repel this mutiny, and if you think otherwise, then I think you might somehow change your optics. This is our internal matter, which was settled in a very resolute way, and we're absolutely sure that our country has gone from this experience stronger than it was ever, and the president of authority showed to be.
Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko said that his country wants to learn from the war experience of Russia's Wagner mercenary group. Under the deal brokered by Lukashenko late on Saturday that ended the mutiny by the Wagner fighters, they were allowed either to join Russia's regular armed forces or move with their leader Yevgeny Prigozhin into exile in Belarus. Speaking to Belarus military in Minsk, Mr. Lukashenko said he put the armed forces on full combat alert and was ready to send a brigade to Russia to help Putin to stop the Wagner mutiny led by their leader Yevgeny Prigozhin. The Belarusian leader also recalled his call with the Russian president, Mr. Vladimir Putin, in which he says he'd offered to try to strike a deal with Prigozhin. While part of Wagner's forces is said to be moving to Belarus, Mr. Lukashenko suggested his military could pick up some of mercenary combat experience obtained in Ukraine and elsewhere. Meanwhile, Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko received Defense Minister Viktor Krenin yesterday. Before delivering a report, Mr. Krenin gifted an unusual souvenir to the commander-in-chief. The minister began by saying, "Let me accomplish one mission." The Belarusian president, in shock, said in his words, "Have you brought a bomb?" Mr. Viktor Krenin, on the other hand, said, "That's right, let me give you a symbolic gift, the first nuclear bomb that was developed in the Soviet Union in 1949. It is symbolic that it is kept here. This is a replica of the very first nuclear bomb that was developed in the Soviet Union." The Belarusian leader said, "Our enemies should not think that we are obsessed with symbolism or that we are very happy about nuclear weapons. It's just a symbolic thing." Coming up, more on the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Please stay with us. Welcome back to our coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. We're picking up where we left off now, and we're pleased to speak with Ambassador Joe Keshi, former Permanent Secretary, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, joining us from Abuja, the Federal Capital Territory. It's good to see you, sir. Welcome to the program.
Very good morning to you, and thanks for having me.
You're welcome. Could we begin with this report by the United Nations, where, as they've put it, the global killing of children, and they've fingered Russia in this regard, and they've added them to the offenders list. Now, I'd like to begin by expressing our sympathy for the people of Ukraine and any other parts of the world where minors are killed and children are killed, as well as the people in combat as well, whether in Ukraine or in Africa, in Sudan. But in Ukraine, the first thing that jumped out at me when I saw it was that, okay, so Russia is killing children, it means that they are deliberately targeting children. That was the question I asked, but maybe that's how they phrase it, and that's how it's worded by the United Nations. So could you give me your initial opinion on this global offenders list? And also, let's keep in mind that Ukraine as well was found to be guilty or to be responsible for the killing of minors as well. But they were not added to the global offenders list. But Russia was added to the global offenders list. And Russia happened to have killed more children, according to the United Nations. So are they deliberately targeting children, or are they engaged in warfare that has led to the death of children?
Well, when you bomb schools, when you bomb creches and kill children in school, what does that amount to? I do not think that they deliberately set out to kill children. But from what we know of the Russian activities, when you look at what they did in Syria and what they are now doing in Russia, I'm not too sure that these fellows have a real, game plan. I think theirs is just to destroy as much as possible and pressurize the opponent, in this case Ukraine, to give up. And I want to believe that they thought this could be a swift military operation, but it has turned out, otherwise. And as a result, they've just become senseless in the way they bomb or they send their, arsenals all over the place. Some have landed in schools, some have landed in hospitals. And when you see these things happening, it might not be deliberate, but look, it has their action, their inability to have a real game plan, not just destroy infrastructure, destroy schools, destroy hospitals, destroy power plants. I mean, how do you describe that? And so I think the UN is justified to put them on the list, if for nothing else, for their recklessness, for their lack of concern. Look, you cannot describe residential areas as military targets. And the bulk of where they have destroyed have been residential areas, and children live in those residential areas as well. So I think I agree with the United Nations. They just have to be on the list, if for nothing else, because of their recklessness and carelessness in their operations.
What about Ukraine not being on that same list, even though they're also responsible for the killings of minors as well, which has been openly tabulated?
But I have not heard that Ukraine bombed schools. That's the difference. I've not heard that they bomb schools. Look, if you bomb a military settlement or barracks, and there are children living in there, yes, this is war. But if you deliberately target or hit schools, particularly schools like primary schools and secondary schools, and destroy those schools, and children are killed, and you did it not once, not twice, not thrice, what do you expect? I mean, I think the world should just rise up and condemn the action. They should attempt to be more precise in their operations. They should focus on military installations, and not just this indiscriminate, bombardment of infrastructure, residential area. Look at all the places that have been destroyed in a number of Ukrainian cities. They are not military targets, for goodness sake. They are pure and simple residential areas, civilian areas. Schools cannot be described as military targets. So they may not have intended to do that, but that's what has happened.
Yeah, so I take it you don't put much stock in Russia's denial that they were targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure, because they've denied it.
When this war started, in the first places they bombed, it was residential areas. This is what they did in Syria. So it's nothing new. I mean, this is their war style. Right.
So because of that, and because we know that, and the Ukrainians have also known that, if you are aware of the bomb shelter problem they have, and where Recently, about 3 people died trying to gain access to a bomb shelter when there was a raid going on by the Russians, and having been alerted by the sirens, they made to the shelter to find it locked. Vitaly Klitschko, the mayor of Kiev, has been sanctioned by Vladimir Zelensky, and he's called for an audit concerning these bomb shelters. It's very surprising that this late in the war, only about 14% of the bomb shelters are fit for use, and 44% are even operational, even though they know that they've come under fire by the Russians and civilians have been hurt. How come their bomb shelters, which should have been the first thing, or one of the first things as a priority that should have been taken care of, seems to be not high on their list?
Look, you have to go back a little bit. I do not think when this war started that Ukraine was 100% prepared. And that's the simple answer I can give you. But along the way, they've been trying to, get things up and running. Look, how many years ago did war end in the whole of Europe? If you go around Europe today, I'm not sure how many bomb shelters are operating or are in operation. Okay, so I think what they've discovered is that most of their bomb shelters are not in operation, and they just have to do what they need to do to get them to become operational, so that they can utilize them. I mean, look, as they go along, they learn. This is the honest truth. War ended in Europe almost how many years ago? And all these shelters, in some countries, they've been converted to something else because they are not expecting any major war like you are seeing today. And this is the most unfortunate thing when you come to think of it, that a region that has experienced war, all sorts of wars before 1945, or if you go back to history from the Westphalia, agreement that ended a number of wars, to see that Second World War, First World War, Second World War, all these things were constructed, and then they decided to make peace. 70 years, almost 70 years, Europe has enjoyed peace. And suddenly you have this war. So I can understand what the inability of the Kiev mayor to make these things ready. But I think that I'm very confident and sure that with what the president has done, they are going to, up their game and get the shelters ready for their people.
Ambassador Keshi, let's now focus on the path to peace. There's been several attempts from several quarters for this war to be brought to some sort of armistice, if not a treaty, to bring it to an end. There's been the Ukrainian 10-point peace plan. There's been the African mission peace mission plan. We've had confidence building.
Forget the African peace mission plan, please. Let's be serious and talk something. You saw the way the African leaders were treated. It was a big joke. So let's deal with more serious issues. It was the president of South Africa on an ego trip, and this was not lost on his host. So let's talk of more serious, issues, please.
But President Putin didn't call it a big joke. He says that it was useful. He said that it was a useful endeavor. President Zelensky was not as warm, but he didn't condemn the trip either.
I've never seen a situation where another president interrupts a visiting president and almost wants to give him a lecture. But what I'm telling you is that people might not like my comment, but the truth of the matter is that the president of South Africa was on an ego trip on its own, and that's, for me, that's just it. So you really can't, But look, let's talk about peace. There is going to be no peace until the parties are ready. And the parties will not be ready for Russia. Russia's design is to take over Ukraine. For the Ukrainians, they want to recover, at least now, they want to recover all their territories. And as long as they've not recovered most of their territories, I think we are very far away from peace.
Ambassador Keshi, whether people like your opinion or not on the African peace mission is neither here nor there, because you have a right to that opinion. You say that it's an ego trip by Cyril Ramaphosa. But was he the only one on that trip? We had other nations, including Egypt, including the Comoros, who were also on that trip.
No.
And some of the
Egyptian president was not there, remember?
The president of Egypt could not go, yes. He sent a representative. I'm sorry, can you hear me?
Let's not belabor this issue. The trip, if you want to, it was okay, fine. Africa got involved to make peace. Very good. Let's move on with it.
What about the grain? What about the Black Sea grain deal? I mean, you know that we, even though it's been said, and it's quite correct, that we should produce our own grain, but we've needed that grain from Ukraine, and it has affected markets in Africa.
Look, there are a lot of things that goes into peacemaking. You must first of all have a strong position. You must have how to have like in this case, you must have a strong team that your host will look at and say yes, irrespective of the fact that every country in the world has one vote in the United Nations. Every country in the world is a sovereign state and things like that. But when you're talking of making peace and intervening in between countries like this, you have to go with a very strong team. And let's face it, not with a third team or a team the third tier of the league. And this is the honest truth. So when you see presidents sending representatives, the ambassadors in Moscow, or asking somebody to join, it is out of respect. It is out of respect to another president that's okay, if this is what you want to do, we don't mind, I'll send my representative to join you. At least it increases the number. And Africa can say, yes, they've done very well and things like that. But beyond that, I do not think much was achieved. So
is that not a danger that erodes the importance of Africa? You know about the global south and the global north.
No.
And you know that Ukraine has been courting Africa for a while. Ukraine sent... Sorry, can I finish? Ukraine sent its envoy to Africa twice. And it shows how much Africa is important. Africa is part of the global south with many developing countries, but important to Ukraine and also important to Russia. That's why Russia sent their own diplomatic envoy to Africa.
Yeah. Look, Africa is important to the two sides as they seek to gather support for their cause or causes. There's no doubt about that. But when you want to get involved in peace, you must also ask yourself, what is my strength and ability to make peace? And by the way, what peace proposals do you really have on the table? Beside that, those who are capable or who have the strength and influence to make peace have actually attempted to, and they have all woefully failed, simply because at this point where we are, peace is almost impossible as long as both sides have not achieved their objectives. As a result of that, you do not just get up and decide that, look, we are going to go into it. And what exactly was the proposals put on the table by the African delegation? Did they ask the Russians to withdraw all their forces back home and Ukraine not to join NATO? Was such a proposal on the table? I don't know. You may enlighten me. So I'm saying let's not belabor this issue. It was a mission that went. It was historic according to the leader of South Africa. But to some of us, it was just an unnecessary ego trip, period.
The final points of that, of the peace plan from Africa, it's in the public domain, and it was one of the problems that Ukraine had with it concerning the total withdrawal of the troops from Ukraine by Russia. But thank you so much, Ambassador Joe Keshi, for your insights in this issue. Former Permanent Secretary, Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Thank you so much for coming on the program this morning. It's much appreciated.
Thank you.
Now, the U.S. State Department spokesperson Matt Miller, as we've been reporting, says the United States will very soon announce actions to hold the Wagner Group accountable, although the move will be over the mercenary group's Prigozhin's prior activities in Africa and won't be linked to the recent mutiny by the Wagner Group. He did not detail what the planned U.S. action will be, but when pressed, said it will be announced this week.
Continue to closely track Wagner's activities both in Ukraine and in Africa and in wherever in the world they may operate. We continue to look closely at the actions they take that are against the interests of the countries where they operate, and we will continue to take actions to hold them accountable. And in fact, we will have further announcements to make on holding Wagner accountable in the very near future. Whatever you call Wagner Group, I think what's important are the steps that we take to hold them accountable. And the United States has taken another number of steps to hold Wagner accountable in imposing sanctions, as I said, indicting the head of Wagner, Yevgeny Prigozhin. And we will continue to take steps to hold them accountable. I don't think the label is as important as what we do. And I would say stay tuned. In the very near future, you will see additional steps by the United States to hold them accountable for actions they've taken. I would say with respect to Wagner, we would continue to urge any governments who have considered inviting Wagner to operate inside their borders, who have considered security arrangements with Wagner, who have considered any sort of cooperation with Wagner at all, we would continue to urge them to not pursue those arrangements. I would not want to get ahead of any other announcement that we were considering taking, but the announcement I was specifically referring to relate to their actions in Africa.
Now we'd like to talk to Mr. Yinka Oyeniji, International Affairs Analyst, joining us from East Midlands in the UK. Good morning and welcome to the program.
Morning, Mr. Macaulay.
Good morning. How did you take the dispersal of the Ukraine Wagner Group and now their foray into Belarus on the orders of Putin? What was your initial reaction? We haven't spoken about it, so I'd like to know how you felt about it.
Oh, well, so whether you call it a coup or you call it a mutiny or you call it an incursion, I don't think that it was a surprise. Okay, it was not coming. Immediately we started to have those drone attacks in Russia itself. It was obvious that the war in Ukraine was taking a new coloration. There are a few factors that are involved here. Okay, so number one is the fact that Putin himself is trying to perpetuate himself in office. He's hoping to extend his reign in Russia beyond 2030, and the parliament signed a law to that effect. That was the first thing that happened. And then the second, well, before that, there was also annexing Crimea and all that. So the people in Russia would want Putin to go. Putin would want to consolidate his hold on the presidency in Russia, and because of that, he's made this incursion into Ukraine. And right after that, there are still people who will want to take advantage of the situation to ensure that Putin is no longer president in Russia. All right, so some of those people actually also include this Wagner group leader who thinks that it's an opportunity to leverage. There are also senior officials of the Kremlin who would like to take advantage of what is happening in Ukraine and Russia at this time. So the Wagner group turning on Putin was a long time coming, and it's happened. The only thing that's probably surprising is the fact that Belarus is now coming into the fray to try to calm frayed nerves. But the thing is, even Belarusian president himself seeks to use this as a leverage against Putin, as something in the future to say, you owe me for helping you diffuse that tension, all right? So now Belarusian president is almost at par with the Russian president because he can have bragging rights to say, I saved the day with dousing the tension between the Wagner group and Russian forces.
A Navy Commodore we had on the program yesterday, also diplomatic affairs analyst, spoke to us and gave us a theory that I think is worthy of another mention. He says that because of Putin's antecedents, that it may be a deception, and this move by Wagner Group to Belarus is not a disbandment, but a deployment in disguise because of Kiev's proximity to Belarus for a future attack.
That cannot be at all, and I'll tell you why that can't even be. It's Putin who has lost the most over the weekend. Nobody wants their government to be challenged. We seem not to be able to count the casualties of what happened this weekend. They shot down planes. These Wagner group guys were not playing. They shot down planes. And there was a statement he made which can never be forgiven. Putin will eliminate people for making statements that are not even as good as that. He said, we are going to have a new president. That is a categorical statement. While I believe that the coup, I don't even think it was a coup. It was just a Wagner man saying that I can come against Russia if I wanted to. Not that he had the means. And it was based on money. If you want to decipher what is happening, follow the money. Okay, over 40-something million in dollars, if I'm not mistaken, were found in cash at one of the offices of Wagner right there in Russia. I remember that a few weeks before now, an ultimatum had been given to all the private military companies to register with the army in Russia. But Wagner was never going to do that. The Wagner problem is a conundrum. You can never arm ex-convicts to fight your battle and they won't turn against you. The Wagner leader wanted his money. And the only way he was going to do that and get Putin's attention was to say, you know what, we are coming for the Kremlin. He was never going to ever win that battle. From the air, he would have been taken out. Okay, but Putin was surprised that he would go to that extent to try to get his attention. And so that's why they're organizing some kind of exit for him. Because take it or leave it, this Wagner guy is going to pay for what he has done. Putin takes no prisoners. Everybody wants Putin to go, but nobody wants to take that bold step. He has tried to take it as a bargaining chip to be able to get his money. That money, I'm not sure he's going to get. The Belarusian president may have been part of the deal. Would he be able to topple Putin? Absolutely not. So he's played his last card, and Belarusian president just took that opportunity. It's not as if the Wagner guy himself wanted to put himself in battle. But this is the hands of the Belarusian president wanting to be able to stand toe-to-toe with Putin. The Belarusian president simply hijacked the situation and said, I helped to diffuse this tension. So, Mr. Putin, you owe me, and I'm no longer your stooge. We can now stand apart. That's what's happening.
Where does that now leave, in your opinion, Moscow? Is there an uneasy calm, or it's a consolidation of unity, to paraphrase the Russian deputy UN ambassador, who says that people from the outside looking in, look, you're not Russian, you don't understand us, we're coming together, this has made us stronger, this adversity. Is that, do you think that's the way things really are, or it's just another PR to stunt, as it were, to make people believe that Putin is as strong as the ambassador, the deputy UN ambassador, says he is? Damage control, if you like. Excuse me?
No, not even damage control. It was a bold-faced lie. I was looking at him saying that. Everybody now knows that Putin is not impenetrable. We all know Kremlin is not impenetrable. And I mean, nobody, for whatever it is worth, nobody wants to be exposed that way. You can see that China is also distancing itself, because China now knows that if Putin could have fallen like that in his own home, then they can't rely on Putin being able to strengthen whatever they plan, military expedition they plan for the future. So this has deeply embarrassed Putin, and then nobody can say this is an internal affair. Internal affair, you have lost planes, you have lost assets, you have lost individuals, some of your best pilots over a weekend, that somebody challenges Putin publicly to say, we are going to have a new president. That was a bold-faced lie to say this is an internal crisis. No, it's by no means internal crisis. As it is, it means that Putin can be challenged. It means Putin can be removed. And he has only two options left. Number one is to negotiate and step down from being the leader at the Kremlin and then be given a safe landing, maybe move to Belarus himself or move to China, and then they can have another person as president. That's the first thing. The second thing he can then do is to ride it out and say, for whatever it is worth, even if Russia is going to crumble, I don't have a problem being the last president of Russia as we know it today. But it can't be. It's not even a calm. Everybody will weigh their options once again. Already, the Wagner troops have withdrawn themselves from Ukraine, which means that the Russian soldiers there are exposed. The Wagner troops were leading the charge there, supported by the Russian soldiers, but they've left that place, moved to Belarus, possibly going to be reabsorbed into that army. All of a sudden, Putin has lost an ally. That we cannot argue. And if anybody is saying that the Wagner troops that helped get Bakhmut, that helped to hold down Bakhmut in Ukraine, have now been exposed and also exiled into Belarus, it can't be a win for Putin at all. He's left his own soldiers exposed. We must understand that the Wagner troops came into play only when the Russian soldiers were being decimated. So who takes charge of the war front at this moment? It's not a win at all for Putin. It's not even an uneasy count. It is signs of things to come.
Your opinions have presented a number of intriguing trains of thought. Thank you so much, Mr. Oyeniji, for your contributions on the program this morning. We hope that this war comes to a speedy conclusion with minimal loss of life. Mr. Yinka Oyeniji, who's joined us from East Midlands in the UK.
Thank you also for having me.
Now, I would like to turn our attention to the world of business and how it's being affected by the war in Ukraine. Our business correspondent, Laddie Williams, is with me in the studio. Laddie, good morning.
Good morning.
Now, Narendra Modi was just last week in the United States, and he had a sit-down with Joe Biden,
right,
or a stand-up where they toasted with ginger ale because they don't drink liquor.
Exactly.
And so it's quite a bit of not confusing,
yeah,
but it raises questions that why Russia has become India's largest oil supplier,
yeah,
with a 40% share,
yeah,
knowing that the United States is totally against Russia in its invasion of Ukraine,
yeah,
and India is consolidating its relations with the United States.
Exactly.
What are we missing?
Talking about eating from both sides, at this point, because you're getting that, cheap Russian oil. The Russian euros last averaged about $47 earlier this year, and it's trading about $50 for Russian euros. So it's quite cheap. Looking at the market rate now for Brent and WTI, that's still within that $70 range, at this point. So, as a businessman, as a refiner, you're looking for cheap oil, at this point, and Russia's presenting that, and it's quite a competitive, market at this time. We've seen a big 40% share, about 46% share of supplies, from Russia. That's the biggest supplier right now to India, at this point. And, it's because the oil is cheaper, at this time. And we're seeing, other, before, when you see, tankers, heading into India, you'd guess that the tankers are coming from either the Middle East or from the U.S., or West Africa. But now it's almost a certainty that these tankers are coming from, Russia. And at the end of the day, that's helping them, the refiners, get oil cheaper and, sell at, prices that are not too high, in the country. So that's also helping the energy market. And at the end of the day, this is keeping, Russia, afloat, at this time. We've seen how, the U.S. and the allies have tried to sanction, all those exports, coming out from Russia. But, big buyers like China and India are still, buying that Russian oil. We're seeing them still, stay afloat at this time. But the big question is, can this buying spree continue, from India? So that's what, everyone's watching at this time. Who knows, at some point, because there was a point, Russian euros were not too, the Indians were not too fond of Russian euros. That's the oil coming from Russia. It supported about 2% of all the supplies that were coming, into India. And fast forward to now, big 46% jump. So we'll keep watching and see if they continue buying that cheap oil, but it makes economic sense, for the country.
The oil prices edged higher today. What's driving that sentiment? Yeah,
so this time is the U.S. The U.S. is at the forefront at this time. We're seeing their drawdowns have reduced significantly in the market, and we've seen that, prop the prices up, but they're still, it was still quite limited because at the end of the day, investors are still watching out for what's coming next for, interest rate hikes from the U.S., still looking at that forward guidance. Are they going to, still keep the rates paused, or are they going to raise rates going forward? So at the end of the day, that's limited the gains that we saw. All that whole mutiny issue, from Russia, that has, died down in the oil market at this point. So we're seeing prices, still, trading between that tight range between $70 to $60 to $70 at this point. So the market is still ranging, still looking for direction at this time, but the bulls are definitely not in control.
In other words, things can change. It's kind of volatile at the moment.
Yeah, we're still watching, everyone's still watching those markets, looking for any sign of escalation. At the end of the commodity prices are riding on escalation at this point. If we see an escalation, with the war, then we'll see those prices, rise.
And there'll be more from Laddie Williams on Business Morning after this program, so please stay tuned for that, Laddie. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
And that is where we will leave it for this edition of our special coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Olumide Macaulay. Many thanks to our guests, our producers, and all of you that were part of it by watching. I'm Olumide Macaulay. See you tomorrow.